first question is open, really, to any of the speakers who would care to answer it. In the light of the scriptures calling us to mortify our fleshly desires, and what Paul says in Romans 7, is holiness monergistic or synergistic? For those of you who are not perhaps au fait with the complications of theological vocabulary, monergistic, worked by God alone, completely alone. Synergistic, worked by God uh, and with the or through the agency of another. That's very loosely what it means anyway. So, unfortunately, our four men at the front know far better how to explain those things than I do. Anybody care to give that? I mean, I'm thinking this is probably possibly a Pastor Tobias thing, given that you were talking about mortification of the flesh, but I won't tie you down to that.
Who asked that question?
Yeah, that's.
Let him come forth.
It's as well, I think. Okay.
So I'm not sure if I agree with the other men here, but so I don't really like the concept of monergism and synergism because even though I realize that there is some synergistic aspect in sanctification, we are called to do things, but we are also called to believe, and that's our justification, our salvation. So what I would say is maybe to get away a little from the terms, I would say yes, we have to do things in our sanctification, and that's what I talked about, right? There are really things to do for us, but we all do them by the Spirit. We do them by God who is working in us. So even though we are doing things, it's not really us. It's still God working in and through us. Yeah? It says in Philippians, yeah, we heard that yesterday. He even has to work to produce in us the will to do good. So even though I can say, okay, I have done things, but yet it wasn't really me. It was the grace of God working in me. So I think that would be my answer to that. Anyone?
I've always liked the example of you remember the priests when they crossed the river Jordan? They had to go down and they put their feet in the river, and then the water receded, and they were able to pass over. And I think of Peter. Peter walked on the water, but Peter had to get out of the boat. Often God is calling us to obedience, and it's as we strive in that obedience that we find his power unleashed within us. Our sanctification is supremely dependent on God, only independently on us. And yet, we don't want to be passive. We want to be intentional. We want to be deliberate about what we do. We want to apply ourselves. That's what faith is going to do. Faith is going to believe God's promises, and we're going to go forward, and we'll see mountains move before us, mountains that we don't have the power to move, but that he does. But it's as we strive in obedience.
Thank you. Can I just, before going on to the question, there was a, yeah, I will pass, go on, I'll go to you first.
Just one quick thing on this. I have shared this analogy with, I think, the members of our church just once before, but I give this picture from the time in my honeymoon when my wife and I, we climbed the top of a mountain and we got to the last part, and it was basically too high a point for my wife to be able to climb independently. So she literally needed me to be holding on to her to pull her up, but she was holding on to me almost for dear life. So I think with regards to these sorts of questions, it's similar with regards to God's sovereignty and man's free will. Sometimes we put them in a tension where they shouldn't be. And the Lord is absolutely sovereign over all, and he is holding on to us. That's the means by which we're saved and we grow in our sanctification. But that's not to suggest that we would be, oh, well, you've got a hold of me, so I'll just do my own thing. There's that grabbing hold of God because he's the one we desire for and yearn for. And I think it's good to have both of these things in view, which I think a lot of the talks in this conference has helped to address.
wanting to take a verse out of context or misuse a verse or anything, but there is, of course, this verse: his people will be made willing in the day of his power. So as he's exerting his power, it is also at that same time that power is also producing a willingness on the part of the people. So again, the tension is resolved in that um, part of the exercise of God is to make the people do their part of it in it, so to speak. Um, uh, Pastor Conrad, do you have anything to add to all of this? I mean, I might have just said something terrible, so no. Well, the second question is actually specifically for Pastor Tim. Um, I will read it in full. Are we in danger of drawing an unbiblical distinction between the head and the heart, or our knowledge and our actions, when approaching sanctification from the standpoint you've presented? Is the transformation of our hearts not by the renewing of our minds? Obviously taken from Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Let me just ask that again.
If if whoever asked that question doesn't mind letting themselves be known, um, I'm not sure exactly, unless the other guys here on the panel understood that exactly, like what exactly is being looked for there. Um, Based on my teaching, is there a difference between mind and heart? I mean, I could talk about maybe my perceived ideas about the difference between the mind and the heart, but I'm just not sure what exactly the question has to do with. Are you, moderator, are you?
What
Are,
am I thinking? Um, I mean, just looking at the question alone, I'm assuming that um, the implication is that our conduct is led by the renewing of our minds. That will lead to the other. Um, so I don't know whether that's quite whether the mystery questioner would like to elaborate. That would be good as well.
well, clearly, I think that the verse obviously that I was wanting us to really feel is Romans 6:11, and that has to do with believing facts. And I think that I've always liked the way Jonathan Edwards he he desired affection, he desired emotion, he desired passion from his people, as long as truth was always prompting that affection. And we we certainly want to be a people that are grasping with our minds. We're knowing, we're coming to a knowledge, we're digging into the Word of God. Our faith has to be based on propositions, truths from the Word of God. And then from that, our passions, our motions, they flow out of that.
Well, if that wasn't satisfactory, then I apologise. But I think that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. So, um, okay. So now we're actually sorry, I'll stand. We are now on to something which is just picking up on a small element of what was said. So this is not specifically related to the overall concept of holiness in the church. As a church leader, which all four of you are, how do you respond to young men who are enthusiastic and seeking to be in church leadership now, but they are, as Pastor Tim says, proud Calvinists who want to have a voice in all things? How would you handle such a young man? I have a feeling Pastor Conrad might be quite a good one for this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think, first of all, I would recognize the fact that Christian growth is for everybody. Nobody has arrived. Even those who we consider to be mature and are leading the church, they are also growing. And so it's not like there is a platform and that platform, you must not um, do anything in the context of the church, but rather it's a continuum, it's a ladder on which people are continuing to grow step by step from one degree of glory to another, as we heard. So having acknowledged that, I think what I would do, which is what we have done in our own church, is to encourage all our members to be involved in one area of church life or another. And a lot of that has to do with outreach work, but doing it together with other believers. What that does is that you start having individuals knocking heads in a smaller, more containable context, rather than when a person now has become a church elder. I think at that point, you really have a disaster on your hands. And so, as long as that person is willing to be led by elders, therefore, while these things are happening, at least I know that the elders are overseeing and will be able to help out. I'm reminded specifically now of Romans 12, which simply brings out the fact that if this is your gift in the body of Christ, use it. And it's not suggesting that there is some level of maturity that you need to have. So it says there, Romans 12 and verse 3, for by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, okay, so that's not just some, but everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought, but to think with sober judgment, okay, and then it adds, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. So he's urging us to not be either too proud or over humble, which in itself is often pride viewed from the wrong side of the telescope. So he's saying, be honest with yourself under God. But then immediately after that, he says, for as in one body we have many members, and the members not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. And I think this is the issue was the questioner has brought up. Here's a person who is within this body, but then he is so full of doctrine and therefore thinking he knows it all when he is all head and no body. Okay, so he's not really able to function within the context of the church. What should happen? Well, here's the answer. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given us, let us use them. And then he gives a number of examples. And I think that's really what I would urge this person to do, is to simply begin to participate in the ordinary things of the church, laying out the chairs, opening the windows, going out to provide soup to the hungry, and so on with other believers. And that's where the temper and everything else will be exploding. And that's where, in real life, the person then begins to be helped to see that having doctrine is one thing, allowing that to transform your life is another, and that's where he needs to concentrate. So that's what I would say to begin with.
What I think I would like to add is that the Bible gives qualifications for elders, right? So when it comes to the question, is someone able to be a pastor in the church, an elder in the church, then you look at the qualifications in the Bible, 1 Timothy 3 and so on. So, and doctrine is in there. He must be able to teach. I believe that's also referring to a solid doctrine, yeah? A healthy doctrine. But the rest of the qualifications given is not about your doctrine, not about your ability to teach sound doctrine, but it's about your character. So, and if you are a pride person, you will probably not pass the test. Um, so that's why I think it's always important to look at these qualifications. And if you see that the young man uh, will not fulfill one of these, then he can work on this qualification. And I just would like to confirm and to yeah, to strengthen what Conrad said. Um, have them first do small things, because if you are faithful in the small things, then you can be set on for higher things or greater things. Yeah.
Just one quick addition for our context here in a country like Scotland. Right now, when a question like that may be being asked, one thing I would want to know is this somebody coming from this pastor's local church? And if so, the pastor, the elders, the members of the church would already know and have some investment in this man? Or is this somebody who's coming to a local church, to a pastor, and initially asking this question? Because if they're coming from the outside asking that question, we already have a whole host of character issues to deal with. And just as the fellow brothers have said here, that is what needs to be focused on and invested in. But if it's somebody coming from the outside, the first thing I would be focusing on, let's not even address this question. Yes, it is the desiring the office of elder is a noble task. We see that 1 Timothy 3:1. Before we even get to address this, let's deal with the local church issue and where you've been for the past few years. Are you speaking to your pastor and your church about these things? So these would be things that need to be clarified, certainly in our context, because there are many young men who think that that's what ministry looks like, almost devoid of any actual accountability to their local church.
I guess the one thing that jumps out at me when I hear that is we, my wife and I bemoan the fact at one point in our ministry in San Antonio that we just didn't have young people, and we began to pray. And God began to bring the young people in waves. And I know this. I love a church full of crazies. And when I hear questions like this, I would just say this. So a lot of these guys, they need to be kicked in the rear. They need to be batted upside the head. But what I never want to do is somehow you have to try to get these guys serving serving the body, not thinking too highly of themselves. But you know what we never want to do is squelch the zeal. And as I just heard it on a message either this morning or yesterday that we were listening to driving over here. But the guy was saying, do you, would you rather have a church full of crazies or a bunch of wooden Indians? You know what that is? And just a bunch of people that sit silently. I was going to say like happened when we came to England, um, but no, there's zeal among those folks. This is just different climate and culture here, but we zeal is a good thing. The Spirit of God can produce zeal, and yes, it's at times we get some guys that are just proud, they're arrogant, and in the end, you maybe have to take more severe action. But I'll tell you, having a church full of people that are full of conviction about things, even if they need to be guided, even if they need to be shepherded. Yeah, give me. Somebody might find this a strange thing to say, but give me Corinth. I like that setting. Why? Because the Lord told Paul, I've got a lot of people there. And so if Paul knew anything about that church at Corinth, is the vast majority of those people were real. Give me the problems. You know this as well as anything. You have a church full of children. Take all the children out. It's like where there's no oxen, the stall's clean. You throw some oxen in there, that thing gets dirty. You throw a bunch of little children in this church, especially in a country where you can't spank. My wife and I, we just think that would be a nightmare. But anyway, but you know what happens when you have a church full of little children? There's life. there's life. So one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to kill the zeal.
Um, question is a really powerful one for pastoral, requiring pastoral wisdom. In some ways, it seems like an obvious answer, and yet at the same time, it's obviously coming from a heart that's troubled. I won't say I as I read it. I will say a woman. Is it a matter of wisdom or holiness if a woman does not submit to her husband in areas where he is weaker and less knowledgeable than she is?
Thanks. So we should obey God and not sin. So, and it's a commandment from God that the wife should submit to the husband. And it doesn't say, well, it's unconditional, in one sense. It doesn't say, well, submit to your husband unless you know better. Because, well, that's submission. When you think, at least, I know better, I don't agree with my husband, but now I submit. When you're in agreement, there's no submission there. Yeah, you just agree. But the submission comes in when you think you know it better and you would do it differently, and then you can submit. So that is a commandment, and it's an important one. So that should be the general rule: commit to your husband. Um, but then there are exemptions. You cannot submit to your husband when he wants you to sin, because you have to obey God more than your husband. Yeah. So I believe that the commandment to submit is rather wide. Yeah, you have to submit as long as you're not. It would not be a sin to submit. So if your husband tells you, well, I don't want you to go to church, you go to church. Yeah. Says it, I don't want you to pray, you pray. Um, so I think that's the line there. Yeah. Submit to your husband. That's a commandment. It's not wise. Yeah. It's not wisdom to say, well, yeah, God says I should submit, but it's wiser not to. No, God has said what is wise and good to submit. And that's the line there. Yeah. When it would be sin to submit, then you have to obey God rather than men.
Just one practical example that I think is worth considering in Scripture is that of Abigail. So if we consider that her husband is a fool and he is literally leading his entire household and people who are around him to their death by riling up King David, and there are aspects of what Abigail does that we can certainly not just question but identify as being wrong, but she does demonstrate a posture of submission, both in terms of recognizing David's office, but also with regards to her husband, because she is seeking to take action for the foolishness of her husband. Now, this is a challenging situation here because, in line with what Tobias has just said, there are going to be instances where it's a black and white. If, for example, it is about gathering to worship the Lord, then you will do that even though your husband is seeking for you to do something else and calling it submission. But there will be some more gray areas. If, for example, it's to do with the education of children, if it's to do with issues connecting with work, for example, if your husband wants you to go into the workplace and earn a second wage, and you believe biblically that it's right for you to be with your family at home, what do you do about that? There are these biblical tensions here, and I think there are ways in which you can seek to still be submitting to your husband whilst also honoring the Lord with biblical commands. But it does require a lot of pastoral insight, and this is why the local church would be an important point in these areas to be of support and care to speak to both husband and wife. I don't think that in any instance there should be a case where a wife ordinarily is just going off to seek to do something separate of her church, for example. So I think these are some good things to consider, because I think when you get into the practical realities of it, it can become quite grey in these areas when you're dealing with different biblical commands. There are some that are explicit, for example, worshiping the Lord, praying, but there are also these other ones where there are clear biblical convictions you have on the one hand, but also the call to be submitting to your husband. And that's where you have these tensions that would require quite a bit of investment, with ideally, by God's grace, husband and wife involved.
So related to that, and I'm going to emphasize a word here because I think it is important to approach this question with the right spirit. Um, my husband is on a minimum wage and can't meet our needs. Is it right for me to give up home working and pursue a career where I can be more useful, fulfilled, and bring in money? I want to assume, and I hope, brothers, you don't mind me forcing this on you, I want to assume that this wife is correct in her statement that he can't meet the family needs through the salary he is earning. Then what? Should I answer it? No. Nobody's putting their hand up. I'm gonna pick on somebody. I'm good. No, come on then. If you're willing, I'm very glad.
Okay, so you already assumed that that's the case. I would always. I'm not sure about how exactly the social system here works in the UK, but I think in the Western world it's probably difficult to starve to death. So that's probably one thing. Can he really not support the family? Are there no helps available and so on? But assuming that that's the case, I don't believe that the Bible teaches that a woman can only work in the household. Paul said that she should be concerned with the things regarding the household, but you also got Proverbs 31, and there's a wife not just cooking and baking, but she's producing things, shirts and she's selling them. So I believe there is a good possibility, and it's biblical, if a wife also does something to earn money and be a help for her husband and for her family. The question I would ask them: what would be a good job to do? Yeah. So should you go a full-time job somewhere in yeah so the problem is if you go out, leave the house 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, and submit to some other man and working for him and basically making him rich and bringing some salary home, you can do that. But I would ask whether there are better options. For example, like Proverbs 31. So can you open an own business? Is there something you can produce, maybe at home, and can sell it on the internet or so? So be creative. Think about how you can work and earn money to help your husband, to help your family, but still do it in a way that is most pleasing to God. And I think there are many possibilities. Be creative, pray about it, think about it, yeah, to get good advice. I think that would be the best answer probably I can give.
I think sometimes it comes down to a standard of living, and there's this perception that we can't make it. I know this. My wife spends a lot of time instructing ladies, and she really encourages women to think you only have one window of opportunity with your children, and they grow up quick. They're little today, and they're out of the house tomorrow. You have this window of opportunity. A mother who is investing herself in her children will make a difference in those children. And what you can't get away from is this: that woman in Proverbs 31, even though there may have been some things she was doing outside the home was all she was doing was rotating around that. And you ladies, you get one shot at this. If you sacrifice your children for the sake of gain, for the sake of a better lifestyle, you'll regret that in the end. Pour yourself into your children. I suspect that if you trust the Lord, if you're determined that no, we're going to go in a direction here where the children are are going to receive, maybe mom is going to work, maybe she can do something from home, maybe she can do a Proverb 31 type thing. But ladies, don't sacrifice your children. let it be the last option that you would go and work. And my wife tried to do a cheesecake business when the children were young. But like she says, she was having a difficulty when she was doing homeschooling with the children. Half of her brain was on cheesecakes and the business, and she felt divided. And in the end, we had to sell the business because she just recognized that as much as we wanted to try to have a home business that we were bringing the children into, that my wife was actually being consumed with this and her attention was going away from the children. As soon as that became evident, she stopped. But it is true. Your children are at this age where they're malleable, that where you need to be pouring into them, where you need to be investing. Don't take those years of your life and pursue career or somehow justify that you have to have a better standard of living and sacrifice those children. Just be very careful. Don't do that. Don't do that easily, lightly, and do it. I mean, strive in faith. We really do have a God that answers prayer. There can be possibilities that your husband can get a better paying job, or that any number of things can happen. Where I think what you have to become convinced of first is how important having mom invest into those children is, and especially trying to keep those children from influences, especially at the younger ages, and have mom pour into them. If you start making those priorities and then commit it to the Lord with that already prioritized, you may be really surprised to see what kind of prayers God will answer in the midst of that.
Yeah, very quickly, we've got 1 minute left. Go.
I love cheesecake. But no, I just want to add something because Jesus addresses this topic. He says, don't worry about these things, what you will eat or drink also, yeah? What you will wear. Trust in him. You have a good father. A father will not let his children starve to death. Yeah? He will clothe them. So what should you do? Well, seek God and his righteousness, and he will provide. So it's also a matter of faith.
Just very quickly to pick up on the question, we'll have to finish at this point, but just there was one word in the question which I think Pastor Tim has really sorted out. I just wanted to bring back to you this consent. This question was where I can pursue a career where I can be more fulfilled. And I think Pastor Tim, particularly what you said there, made it very, very clear. You will not be fulfilled in a career in the same way as you will be fulfilled obeying God as a Christian wife and mother. We are actually needing to stop now. We have two other questions, but both of which can be answered very quickly. Pastor John William, what do you think? Very quickly. Okay. So one is this. Because we're not all from exactly the same sort of church, the question is this: what is the Reformed view of singing and praying in tongues? Well, it can be quick, I think. I hope.
So it's quite helpful that in our church we've recently been preaching through 1 Corinthians, so we've been addressing this issue. So in terms of a reformed position on this, couple of things to identify when it comes to a key chapter that many in the charismatic movements refer to about tongues. There is a distinction in chapter 14 between the actual gift of tongues, which was something that during the apostolic time people could speak, and that's a plural in 1 Corinthians 14, tongues. And then we see the singular tongue speaking, which was effectively chaotic babble amongst the Corinthians. And often it's the chaotic babble that people jump on today and assume, well, the tongue speaking of then is the tongue speaking today. But we see clearly and consistently throughout the Acts of the Apostles that the gift of tongues was other languages. We see that as we study Acts. We see this as what's referred to here. If we're trying to say that it's also an angelic language, well, we have no teaching in the New Testament giving us guidelines as to what that language looks like, and certainly in any contemporary setting. Now, there's about 6 sermons that I've preached on this recently that you can look up. I'm sure some of the other brothers have preached on this, but this would be a kind of very whistle-stop tour summary of a reformed position on tongue speaking, that it would be something that very much was a spiritual gift in the apostolic time, but with the closing of the canon today, it would something that we believe is applicable in today's time as we see in the New Testament.
There is a tradition in these sort of things, if you're ever watching these things on YouTube, where there should be one vaguely trivial question to close. And I was given one. It was for Tobias. How does a man cultivate a good quality beard? Pastor Conrad wants to comment on this.
Well, you could. Well, okay, so it begins with changing your mind and understand that, to quote Spurgeon, well, growing a beard is a habit, most natural, manly, biblical, and beneficial. Just do it.
Thank you. Pastor John Williams, do you want to take that? Unrelated.
Please see the COVID lockdown of 2020 if you want to see me with an impressive beard.
There was another good reason for giving you the microphone, because we are come to the end of our questions, which means that it's actually your turn.